In this episode, we take a look at the explosion of sports gambling in our society and look at how it has changed both the business of and the culture around sports. And in part two of our discussion, we will discuss recent discoveries on how ultra processed foods affect how our brains work at a fundamental level. Hello, welcome to the Call It Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and riding shotgun with me is a man who knows how to keep the pod rolling like it's a Cadillac. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, think it's time to throw some D's on it?
Yeah, man. You're messing me up because I love Mercedes, but I can't deny a good automaker from America. So now I don't know where to choose, right? But I'll throw some D's on it.
All of the above.
Let's go.
All right. Now, before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I ask that you hit subscribe on YouTube or like or on your podcast app. Doing so really helps us get the show out there more. Now, we're recording this on April 9th, 2024. And Tunde, it's been almost 6 years since the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the federal law that barred sports gambling in every state except Nevada. And now we're up to 38 states plus the District of Columbia where sports betting is legal. And we've seen the major sports leagues all partner up with the sports books. And we've seen the idea of a sports book change from like a room you go into in a casino or something like that and walk up to the window and place bets, or, a back alley bookie or whatever, to, an app on your phone. We've seen, sports book advertisements just blanket everywhere, in whether it be advertisements in sports or even beyond that. So you can't even watch or read about sports really without getting inundated with ads from sports books. So now that sports betting, is spread out like it has, Tunde, what really stands out to you as far as how this has become so ubiquitous?
That's a great question, especially after I'm tired from staying up watching the Final Four last night, which I did not bet on and didn't appear to be worth betting on.
Well, it depends on what you would have been betting.
Yeah, but no, it's look, this is to me an interesting conversation. Gambling is not something that is really in my everyday wheelhouse of life. I got other vices. That's not one of them. I am human, but that's not one of them. No.
Yeah, this is one of the fundamental ones of humanity.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is in researching. That's why this is a fun topic for me, because it's not something I'm steeped in. But in reading and preparing for today's show, it was a good reminder to your point. I mean, I did my nerd rabbit hole, which was look at the history of it, and found records dating back to 4,000 years ago in Egypt. They recorded gambling games and things like that. So to your point, I mean, there's history of the Buddha discussing gambling, Jesus discussing playing dice, things like that. So clearly, the idea of gambling, I think, is rooted in the human mindset of things like competition, things like that. So I think gambling's probably been around since humans have been cognitive. So that's number one. Number two is what's different today. And in doing, just again, preparing for today, I found, which is very interesting to me, that gambling, to your point, since this legalization in 2018, or I'd say the expanded legalization
by the Supreme Court. Just for reference, what the Supreme Court did, there was a law from the dated to the 90s that barred sports gambling in every state with exceptions. And one of the exceptions was that Nevada could do it. So prior to this, you could go to a casino in Las Vegas or somewhere in Nevada, and they'd have sports books, and you could sit in there and walk up to the window, place bets. Not unlike in some states, they had maybe horse racing or dog racing, and you could go up to the window and place a bet and so forth. And then the Supreme Court struck down that law, so each state basically could make their own gambling laws.
Yeah. And it's very interesting, as you say, because when I was younger, I used to wonder, without having been nuanced in all the laws and how things came about historically, like why Nevada, why Vegas and Reno were the only places besides the Indian reservations that were allowed to gamble. And to your point about federalism and the ideology of states' rights, I mean, to me, I can't argue that the Supreme Court allowed all states to behave in this way, because why give one state like Nevada a leg up and everyone else has to suffer a different rule? So I don't necessarily
and it
disagree
was
with the
states
ruling.
that actually, like Chris Christie, governor, at the time, governor of New Jersey, was the one who, really led that charge with New Jersey suing to make rule that law unconstitutional. And eventually he wasn't governor by the time the case got decided by the Supreme Court. But yeah, it was other states like, what? Why can't we get any of this?
Yeah. And so, but, and I know this is basis of what we'll talk a little bit further. What I found in researching was it's just interesting that the way in which we are exposed as humanity or people in our country to the opportunity to gamble, let me put it that way, through our current technology seems to be more disruptive than the other, like you said, then when gambling was either you had to go somewhere physically, like go to a casino or Vegas, or you at least had to go like deal with a bookie or, things like that. The fact that it's available now in the palm of everyone's hand the numbers do seem to tell that it's having a different effect on society than it did up until this point.
Yeah, that's an interesting point in the sense that we can't look backwards because of the current technological environment. We can't look backwards and say, okay, this will play out in this way because we have this as an example. Like we're in uncharted territory, so to speak, when you have the combination, and one of these is older, just sports on all the time, or, sports going, there's, and you can access, it's not like 1985 when there's one game on, Monday Night Football is the only national TV game every week. But everybody, people can't watch, you can only maybe watch a local game and that's it. But now you can watch every game that's happening every night, one. And then two, now you can bet on any of these games, any or all of these games from the palm of your hand. So we don't have much historical guidance on how this is going to play out. And related to that actually was the thing that stood out to me was how quickly all this happened. We go from a situation where, just take for sports media, for example, like the ESPNs of the world, they don't discuss gambling lines. They don't discuss, the gambling angles, even though that stuff in Nevada, it was legal and it was happening all over, but it's like taboo. They don't discuss it. The sports leagues want nothing to do with it. They wouldn't even put teams in Las Vegas. And, to now where it's like full embrace, and then ESPN has their own betting app, and the sports leagues are putting teams in Vegas. They got sports books in arenas for some of the sports and the teams. And so it went like a complete 180 where in the leagues have changed their tunes. The leagues were saying this was up until the point Supreme Court ruled. The leagues were on the side of gambling should not expand. It's terrible. It'll destroy our businesses, to full embrace. And, and so how quickly that happened. And now, 38 states plus the District of Columbia that you have this gambling is it's amazing to me. Like that's the power of capitalism and money, so to speak, that, where an opportunity to get return on investment exists, it takes no time for the money to get there and to back it and to start trying to extract that value out of society. There's a lot of moral concerns. There's a lot of societal concerns that we'll have to deal with and wade into. But the speed in which we go from something that doesn't exist like that from a mainstream standpoint to something that you cannot avoid is just jarring to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it's no surprise when you look at the explosion of the speed at which the technology can make it go from 0 to 100 miles an hour. And then something interesting.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that real quick. Yeah. Like, it does make a difference that you don't have to, like when they did this, they didn't have to go and start doing large scale construction of sports books, like of physical sports books everywhere. They could just have some people in a lab design an app and then it's there. So it not having to do this physical infrastructure, I'm sure plays a role in that. That's a good point.
Well, and the other thing, which I think we should prepare for kind of more of this in our society, because if you really think about it, you make a good point about kind of the proliferation of this. And then it made me think of what I read about the revenue that states are making in general. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit later in more detail, but just for the purpose I'm making now and kind of this discussion here in this part is because with kind of the world moving more really to the information age, again, number one, we don't need as many people in terms of labor doing things to make society productive. So, it used to be, the old pictures of 100 people making one Ford Model T. Now it's all robots, and all those stories we know. So I think number one, we got more people with more time on their hands. Number two is, like you said, we have more access to more stimulation. To your point about how many games you can watch in one day, and like the NFL ticket where you can have on your TV all these different boxes of games. Like when you and I were kids in the 80s, that didn't exist. You just had your TV and the one channel, and you could watch the game one game at a time. And then
you weren't watching games from all over, and you couldn't pick which game you were watching. You had
exactly.
Whatever game they showed.
Whatever was in the market, yeah. And then the other thing I'm thinking is, that's why I just bring up the revenue, the literally the hundreds of billions of dollars that Americans spend on gambling generally, and then what that means in the tens of billions of dollars of tax revenue and other things like that. And that's what I mean. Like, I almost feel like this is going to be the new way that revenue is generated by governments, is basically taxing our vices, because, the idea of manufacturing and labor has diminished in a way that you can't tax that as much. So there's going to be this push and pull on society, I think, where you're going to have the need for revenue and the need for, and especially revenue that doesn't seem that painful, because no one likes the state income tax.
It's considered voluntary. At least to a large number of people. And that's an interesting point, because it really goes into, like, we're familiar with this already with the lottery. Lotteries are put in place by a lot of states. That's gambling, and that's not sports gambling. That's more pure chance, so to speak. And then a lot of times that's used to fund education systems or whatever. And it's an interesting point, that's been called, some people call it like a tax on the stupid, stuff like that, which I'm not going to throw that around and stuff, but I, just noted, you're taxing people that are willing to, quote unquote, throw their money away, because just fundamentally, the reason why casinos are being built and sports books are being developed, apps are being developed, is all this because ultimately the house always wins. They always end up making more money. They know how to do the numbers so that they always win more than they lose, so to speak. And the same thing with the lottery. They wouldn't do that stuff if it was giving away money. But the idea that, to me, is very interesting from the standpoint of, you're correct. You do need to figure out ways to fund society. Productivity has gone up. Per capita productivity has gone up. What do you do? And so you can look at these type of voluntary actions to take advantage of, okay, well, we got to get the money. We can try to, kind of pull it like tooth and nail from people, or we can just set up these systems. But these things all cost society money as well. So there's a certain symmetry to, instead of spending money to try to eradicate it, and you get no return from that, you open it up, you make it legal, you regulate it, ideally. We'll get into whether or not that part has happened yet, but you regulate it, and then you take the proceeds that you're making from a governmental standpoint, you take those proceeds to then deal with the fallout that's going to happen that you would have to deal with anyway. But at least you're using money that's being generated from that activity. And ideally, you generate more money from an activity than just needs to clean up the mess, so to speak, because we're cleaning up the mess anyway. It's just where that money's coming from. So it's a different way to allocate, resources and to generate, kind of the from a state standpoint, what you're going to do to deal with the issues that come out of this.
Yeah, and that's what I mean by I could see this happening more often, because as you're talking, it reminds me a bit of the marijuana legalization. You and I live in Florida, which now has both the sports betting and marijuana legal in certain capacity. Marijuana
is still
medically legal, not recreational. Yeah. But that appears to be a well-regulated thing. The medical marijuana in Florida, there's a certain way you can get a license. A card. You have to go renewals periodically. They only allow you to have a certain amount of grams per period of time. Like every 60 days, you can't have more than an ounce or 2 ounces, whatever the doctor's prescribed. And that keeps people from buying, let's say, a pound, and going to sell it, themselves and things like that. So to me, that's like, okay, that's the proper way to regulate something that society once has considered a vice. And like you're saying, that it's shown that so many people were using this anyway, that it was kind of like the system was just getting gummed up, because you're arresting people and law enforcement's got to waste time for nonviolent people just being arrested for having a bag of marijuana on them. So,
Well, and conceivably, you could use a lot of the money that's, or let's say half of the money being generated from the taxes of that to actually deal with if there's people with problems that come from this
yeah,
or
and
whatever. So
addiction and
yeah. So like you
yeah,
can divert. So instead of that money is coming out of general budget, if otherwise, because you're still going to
yeah,
have to deal with that kind of stuff. So
and that's what I
it
mean.
just
It's
creates a
going.
different kind of mindset of an approach to deal with some of these things that appear to be human behaviors that are going to happen, and so how are we going to account for that? Like there's the criminalizing everything aspect, but then there's also the treatment aspect and all that. And there's various ways.
That's why I want to keep going and now segue to the gambling, because it appears that this legalization of gambling at the state level has not been met with the same type of effort to let me see how to say it, like a forward thinking way of how to regulate it. So that's where I think we run the risk where, I mean, from what I'm reading, is the amount of addiction, especially among young people in their 20s and 30s. And again, without a remedy to help the society deal with that, that's where it can go off the rails a bit, I think.
Or guardrails to try to limit how much that would happen, because those guardrails aren't going to come from industry. Industry once is encouraged and is incentivized to get people doing this compulsively. And that's, I actually wanted to get into that because there's several potential downsides that we've observed. And now when we talk about this, the question of when we point out downsides, it's not to say that you should make it illegal. It's just anytime you have, there's actions, there's reactions, you need to evaluate what's going on to say, okay, well, what can we do? How can we tweak this in order to make it something that's more safe in society, that's more manageable in society, but still maybe not go all the way to a complete prohibition, which generally speaking doesn't work that well anyway. And so are there things that you've seen, that have gone too far? Like you point out, you can get into the addiction issues that we've seen, or things that might need to be reeled back in from the standpoint of now that we've opened this up. And I think we can agree that there hasn't been that second step of, okay, let's regulate this now and figure out ways to make it safer for from a state standpoint, make it safer for the population. That part hasn't happened yet. Unfortunately, a lot of times we've talked about this in other shows. That doesn't happen until you have a bunch of tragedy, a bunch of bad things happen. And then people come and say, okay, yeah, let's regulate it. And it's like, well, a lot of this stuff some of it at least is foreseeable, in terms of the way businesses are going to operate, in terms of the way, like the incentive structure. Let's at least figure out ways to regulate, tamp down on some of the excesses of the incentive structure, meaning the incentive structure being companies are trying to make as much money as possible. So they're going to try to make their products more addictive. They're going to try to market them in a way that, that may be deceptive or, something like that. So, but what stands out to you as far as things that may be going over the bounds of something that would make this sustainable, or making it so that it would be unsustainable and because it's exceeding these reasonable bounds?
I would say everything you just said. And the reason is it's interesting because we did the show last week on more of the tech side of this discussion of algorithms. But that's what I'm saying is, in preparing for today, I couldn't ignore the fact that this change in how people are responding to the opportunity to gamble, let me put it that way, and having it in their ecosystem, the changes seem to be directly correlated to the technology available to us now. So it's the smartphone specifically. This isn't people going to a desktop. This isn't somebody going to a kiosk at a gas station. These changes have happened specifically because of, like you're saying, apps, algorithms in the phones and all that. So as you're talking, it made me realize, I was about to answer you about gambling specifically, but let me start then at 30,000 feet it's another example where the inability for our country, our leaders, however you want to call it, to figure out how to regulate big tech. And by regulate, I'm not trying to say choke off business opportunity and growth. I'm just saying the idea of these algorithms, we haven't figured that out yet. So that's why I realize is, because I'm looking here at one of the stats from the article, 1% of U.S. approximately 1% of U.S. adults meet the diagnosis of gambling, being addicted to gambling. But then it goes on to say that a 2021 survey from the National Council on Problem Gambling, so I think they know a little bit of something on this topic, found that 1/4 of young adults, that's people in their mid-30s and under, have basically shown symptoms of some sort of addictive behavior to gambling, like withdrawal if it's taken away from them, anger, things like this. So what it tells me is that under normal circumstances, maybe, or circumstances before this technology, maybe only 1% of all of us as adults become addicted to something like this. But with this type of exposure, it seems that the younger generation, who are kind of like the petri dish here, this is like an ongoing experiment. They seem to be a quarter is a lot of people, right? A quarter of the young adult population.
Yeah.
So this to me reminds me, it's like politics, right? Not that many people paid attention to politics prior to 10, 15 years ago. All of a sudden, when everything is being fed to you in your phone, you're paying, more people are engaged now. That could be good or bad. And we could say that with many other topics in our society, that it's the phones, the technology specifically in the smartphone that has caused a certain change more so than other types of technologies. That's why I make the example of the desktop and the kiosk at the gas station, because those have been available for a long time for gambling. But that attracted just that 1% of people that had a true addiction. Now what's happening is the smartphones are opening up the opportunity for more people to kind of get sucked into the orbit of potential addiction. And that's just a reality.
The engagement in politics is a good example, actually, a good analogy, because you say, I think it's a good thing that more people are engaged, but we got to look at the way that they're engaged. You know, they're engaged in a way that they're almost being, it's a kind of trigger response engagement. It's not like, oh, let me learn more about this. It's like they're engaged in a way that they're being manipulated in a sense. Like, okay, we know how to trigger someone, let's trigger them with this, and then they'll be Pavlov's dog. They'll do what we know that they'll do once triggered. You know, they'll yell at this person, or they'll, do this or do that. So I think here what we have to be able to observe, and it's a subtle distinction. Making the activity legal, I don't think, is actually what's led to the problems that we've had. It's the marketing and the convenient way that it's been deployed that has led to the issues that we have. So just having it to your point, if we had sports gambling legal, but you had to go to the gas station and go to a kiosk at some building or whatever in order to place your bets, it's not buzzing you on your phone every 5 minutes like, hey, look at this line just moved, hey, all these different things, then it might be received differently. You might not put a quarter of the young people population at risk because they're not these techniques that have been tried and true in order to foster addiction from a social media standpoint and other standpoints. Those techniques won't be used in the gambling context. So, it's not unlike, to me, up until the 90s, like this is something that, we've lost touch with. But up until the late 90s, the FDA prevented big pharma, they didn't prevent them from marketing on television, but the disclosure requirements for any direct-to-consumer marketing for drugs were so onerous that they only could really do it in print. And so, it wasn't something that they could just mass distribute because they had to say all the downsides and all the risks. They had to list them all. And typically there are a lot of downsides and risks to the big pharma stuff. Late 90s, big pharma, or the FDA changed the regulation. They only had to label like the major things so they could start going on TV. And what happened? People started taking more, of these prescription drugs. They kept going to the doctor and say, hey, I think I have this. I think I have that, because of the way it was being marketed to them changed. It wasn't the prevalence of these things and change, but we know the way marketing 101 is that you can make people want stuff if your marketing is good. So that gambling is legal might not necessarily be the issue. It may be that the way that it's being marketed to people and the convenient deployment with these techniques that are known to foster addictive behaviors might be what is creating the risk factor that we really have to look at. And that's where you can look at regulation without looking at prohibition, So it's not necessarily, and one thing I'll add to this just real quick, I'll let you get your comment on it, but the issue of true addiction is one that we have to deal with, but that's where I think we have to look at more larger interventions, more extreme interventions for those people. I don't think you make the general rules for society based on how it's going to be received by the most vulnerable population. But, you might have general rules to say, hey, you can't take advantage of people. We know that you can trigger the human brain in this way, but you can't do that in this context. We just won't let you do it. That kind of regulation I'm saying, but not necessarily the regulation to say we got to regulate this so that even someone who's prone to an addiction won't get addicted, because then you almost end up at prohibition. That's kind of the logic for prohibition a lot of times, is that, oh, well, if some people even get a taste of this, they're going to be addicted. And it's like, well, you can't have freedom in a lot of those contexts if we're looking at only the people that are most susceptible to the worst outcomes.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because my wife has a prohibition on me going to strip clubs. Maybe that's her. Maybe that's her reasoning.
But you don't live in a
If I'm
free household,
exposed,
man. Yeah, that's not freedom. You don't live in a free. That's an authoritarian household, and you are.
Now she only has a prohibition.
You're the underling.
No, she only has a prohibition if I don't tell her. If I tell her I'm going, then she's
okay. So it's a disclosure requirement.
Yeah, it's a disclosure. Yeah, like you're saying about Big Pharma on the commercial. I just got to disclose it, and I got to. Sometimes I got to have a long disclosure depending on what my plans are. But yeah, it's in writing. You're right. I didn't think about that, but yeah, I got to send her an email.
Can't be verbal. It has to be in writing.
Yeah, got to get a lawyer to sign off, and sometimes I got to have her sign an NDA. But that's a whole different discussion.
That's a whole other thing.
But that's a different show for the audience. But she'll have a fun when she sees this. But what? No, just to joke around is just say that I do agree with you that the idea of prohibition, and you're right. This is where I think it's just an interesting conversation about societies, right? Because we've tried a lot of this prohibition stuff in general. We know the famous one with alcohol in the 1920s in the United States, but we've had. I mean, basically, there's a prohibition on gambling outside of Nevada. And I guess it's when you said Chris Christie, it reminded me of Atlantic City when we were kids. Somehow you were able to gamble there. I never understood that,
but not sports gambling. And that's why they wanted to be able to have sports books in Atlantic City. Like in those casinos.
Is that why those casinos went bankrupt?
I don't think that.
Or is there a different reason?
There's a reason why some of those casinos.
That's another show too. So
very few people have proven to be able to lose money on casinos. Very few people.
That's a special quality to be able to actually bankrupt the casino. You got to be really good at what you're doing.
That's one way to put it.
You have to be purposeful.
But yeah, we got to get this back on the rails, man. I wanted to ask you: has anything, as far as things have unfolded, surprise you? As far as, that has there been anything really unexpected or anything that you've looked at and just been like, oh, wow, that we would have never thought that, so to speak?
Yeah. So you used the word trigger, which actually was very apropos. So that's what surprised me, honestly, in researching this. Kind of surprised and not surprised. I mean, it was a surprise. And then I was like, yeah, well, I should have expected that, which is that again, we've beaten this horse already on this discussion, but it's worth it. It's the apps, the technology, the algorithms. I get just the way that, like in other parts of our life, like we're discussing, that they draw certain people into this, and then they get stuck and they get addicted. Kind of like some stock trading apps, and this whole, remember the meme stock stuff. I mean, a lot of that was playing on the same addictive behavior and the impulses created with winning and losing money.
Yeah.
And again, like we talked about, prior to this technology, people couldn't trade stocks in their hand, literally, at any given point of the day. They had to either show up at a desktop or, call a stockbroker back, before the computer. So that's what I'm saying is it's interesting that this is just another way that the tech industry has been able to have things that kind of permeate our attention and our lives.
Well, they're good at it. Yo, you got it. Actually, you were telling me offline as far as like the use of colors in terms of the stock trading apps, and I'm sure that's in the gambling apps as well. But go ahead. So just real quick.
I'll share that, which is, and it's funny because I was just talking to someone last night about that. I've started, for a while now, I've had my iPhone, I put it on grayscale so that it's black and white, and it sucks. Because I was listening to a neuroscientist who actually spent time working at Microsoft's neuroscience lab, and she was saying she was on giving a speech. I wasn't talking to her one-on-one, but she was telling us that Microsoft has one of the largest neuroscience research labs in the world. And it kind of hit me, and I was like, wow, I would have never thought that a software company like that would make that kind of investment. But everything we're talking about makes sense because they want to learn how to understand the human brain for profit at the end of the day, right? Just like food companies and a lot of other types of companies, our psychology is profitable. That's what we've learned with this era. And so, she had said that in that speech that just by putting your phone in black and white, the grayscale, on average, they find that a human being uses their phone 60 minutes less per day. And what she said which hit me was, imagine going to a casino with no lights, or imagine looking at a Christmas tree with no lights. It's just a pine tree. And so that was the point. She said, we scientists know exactly what colors, all this kind of stuff, how to get your mind engaged. And even sometimes when I go to like my stock app, right, if it's in color and it's the market was down today, it's all red, I'll immediately have a certain feeling.
You'll
If
feel
it's all
it.
green, I have an immediate certain feeling. Both are opposite feelings, but it'll be an immediate trigger. And it's interesting when I look at it in black and white on my phone versus my iPad, which I keep in color, I actually have to stop and kind of scrutinize a bit to see the minus or the plus because I can't see the color. And
what
just that
is,
little bit of, and just to finish, just that 1 second of delay I notice the difference. It doesn't allow my emotional state to immediately get triggered, like that word you're saying. I'm able to slowly get into the realization of, was it up or down today?
No, it's because, and we actually, this point came up yet last week, but when it's in color, you go straight from perception to reaction with nothing in between. And so it goes straight to your emotional state. You perceive, you react. When it's not in color, you have to actually, you go perception, cognition, and then reaction. And so there's that intervening step where you got to think about it. And by thinking about it, it blunts the emotional part of the reaction because you're thinking about it and you're like, oh, okay, well, that means I probably got it. You're already thinking about what you need to do with it versus just this, type of thing. And so like, I'm sure, those are techniques that get played out, in this type of context too, which again has nothing to do with gambling per se. That's just how the gambling is presented to you. For me, just real quick, what surprised me actually is, I guess it surprised me only because we're kind of in uncharted territories a little bit. And that is the player reaction or the participant reaction has been one, that's been kind of resentful in some ways, at least not across the board. But I know we've seen issues and there have been scandals. We're not going to really get into the scandals. There's been gambling scandals before, it was legal. There's been gambling scandals now. That's going to be a part of it. Like, we're just going to have to understand that's a part of it. Sometimes having it legal can make it easier to catch stuff, which has happened, but, it's still there. But a lot of times I've heard players, say, hey, I'm just a prop, type, because, with the prop betting, NCAA, with college athletes, they're trying to actually take away the ability to make individual player bets. In some states, they've been successful with this on college players because that creates, this friction where, you're betting on a player to score a certain, not on winning the game or anything like that. And so the players, although, this is something that at least in the professional ranks is going to increase their salaries because this is more money coming into the pot. On the other hand, like, this does make them even more of a commodity, not less of a competitor and more of a commodity. And so a lot of them haven't taken too close to it. And then some of the coaches, same thing, where they're getting yelled at because of this. Oh, why didn't you play this guy 20 minutes? I had a bet that this guy was going to play 20 minutes. And it's like, we're getting further removed. So I'm not saying that's like the worst thing in the world, like there's actions, reactions, but it's just interesting to me to see this. Fans always complain, oh, the coaches, he should have done this. He's stupid, from a win-loss standpoint. But now we got this whole nother layer of coaches and players being aware of, catching flack for, and all this other stuff from all these individual performance metrics, which just, it's not necessarily a great direction to go. I'm not saying it's the end of the world, but it's something you wouldn't necessarily want to have that be front and center in terms of from a sports standpoint, because that may not play out in a way that is long-term sustainable for the legitimacy of the sports leagues if that's something that people are focused too much on.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of wrap it up with this is, if we don't regulate this somehow, the ability for these computers to keep manipulating us, I really think that we are doing ourselves a disservice and our children and the future generations if we don't really revamp how we teach kids at school. Because I think starting in middle school, what you just said about when I was talking about the colors, and understanding that the trigger and response, the shorter that time period, the more emotional a human being will become. So how to create an environment like the example of just going on grayscale, where you are allowing a bit more distance between your trigger and response online. These are all
putting
things
you
that
more
are
in control, like allow the ways to, because right now we're just being led around, at the mercy of the programming of our devices. And so if there are techniques to kind of subvert, now that's on an individual level, and then it also have to be looked at from a regulatory level, and so what needs to be done to protect people from the big tech taking, utilizing techniques to maximize exploitation, and that's, so those are all things we'll have to look at. I mean, we definitely are building the plane while we're flying it. And so, like that's ideally though, we have leadership that can handle these kind of questions and can, come up with kind of a good faith way to approach, versus leadership that just yells and screams.
Well, my concern is that we have leadership like in our state that's worrying about, teaching third graders about being gay. If that's a real threat, I think this stuff is a bigger threat. Like we need to be, how do we teach children to deal with the internet as they get older? So,
But I think we can wrap from there. We appreciate Rod for joining on part one of this discussion. Please join us for part two as well, which will be coming up next.